Hi, thanks for watching another instructional video for CSCI 1300. In this video, we will cover vectors in C++. Vectors are a lot like arrays, but behave more like strings than they do like arrays. With vectors, we can define a vector based on any given type of data type, similar to arrays. So we could have integer vectors, string vectors, double vectors, and so on and so forth. We can describe them with a certain size by listing that size in parentheses when we initially define the vector. And we can also initialize or access an element at a bracket using the bracket notation and an iterative element such as I. Something about defining vectors is that we cannot define a vector with parentheses after the name of the vector. Otherwise, we will have a compiler error. So if you wanted to define a vector of size 0 of some data type, you would say vector, and then in your caret brackets, you would say the data type and then the name of that vector, which would declare a vector of size 0, which you could always just add onto at any given point. It's a lot like declaring a string that is empty. The similar concept applies. You can always add to or subtract from that string. However, in this particular case, we need to make sure that we either specify the size or leave it as 0 if we do not specify a size. If we wanted to initialize a set of numbers or other data type values into a vector, we would have to use a loop. So a for loop works really well with vectors, especially if we know how many things we want to actually put into the vector. So for instance, the thing about vectors is that they don't have a set size. That size can grow or shrink depending on the needs of the programmer or the program. So in this particular case, say we wanted to do 10 numbers after creating a blank vector array of integers, well, we'd have to use a for loop or a loop, like a while loop, to initialize 10 integers, 10 data type values, based on some terminating value. And that terminating value will be the number of things we want to store. So here we're using that 10 to denote the number of things we actually want to store. And then we'll just push back the I iterative value starting from 1 and ending at 10. And the same thing can happen here if we wanted to add information using array notation. We could use bracket notation. So the two ways that can be used to actually add to a vector are either through the pushback function command, which is part of #include_vector, or you can use array notation at a bracket index to update the contents of the vector. So let's look at an example. Suppose that we wanted to declare a vector of integers of size 12. Well, we would say vector int numbers 12, and this would declare 12 indexes where we could store elements. Now, say we wanted to push back a value, and we specified 5 as the value in the parentheses. Well, the pushback function, which is part of #include_vector, would add that at the end location of our vector. And notice that we've actually added an additional index location as well as stored that element, which is really important here. We're adding an index location and we're also adding an element to the collection. Now, say we wanted to remove an element, we could use the popback function, which is part of #include_vector. And what it would do is it would remove the last element in the vector at the current size -1. So we would erase the 5 that we just put in as well as the index location to access it. So this is a lot like adding or subtracting to a string. So a list of common vector commands that might be useful. Say we have some vector called vector name of some data type. We can use a pushback and pass in a value in the parentheses, which will add an element to the end at the current size -1 of the vector. If we wanted to use the .at and specify an index, we could return an element at a particular index. So this is it returns something kind of like a getter function in a class. The vector name.size returns an unsigned integer of the vector's current size. So this would be the same thing as using like a .length operation on a string. It will give you the total number of elements currently stored in the vector. Vector.begin reads the vector starting at an index of 0. So instead of specifying an index, you can always just use .begin. The dot insert function takes in some starting index plus an integer and then comma a value. So it adds an element before an index. The vector.erase takes in some index plus an integer and removes an element at a particular index. So say you wanted to move something in the middle of your array or the middle of your vector out, you could take out that particular element and keep the ordering of your vector. Vector.empty will return a true or false whether or not the vector is currently a size 0 or empty vector. Vector.clear will clear the entire vector of its contents for you. So instead of just using pushback over and over again in a loop, you could just use .clear in one command and do the entire job. So that's all I've got for right now. Thanks for watching and happy coding.